Okay, video two. I'll try to make this one short, but again, I seem to not be able to keep up with my promises. So, the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is the case of divorce. And so, while I think we all, again, I even at the introduction of this chapter, I talked about how divorce and family conflict is a negative predictor for, kids' psychosocial outcomes. But at the same time, it's the divorce rate is actually not substantially increasing. It's pretty leveled off. It was kind of the highest in around the 80s and 90s. It's tapered off a little bit since then. There's certainly a lot more cases, though, of families that aren't getting married at all, single parents, again, more like different kind of family subgroups and things like that, maybe and because of like LGBTQ issues, that perhaps families can't get married in different states, so it's not necessarily a divorce, so that would still, I think, count in some of these statistics. But in terms of divorce, it is declining, and I would say as a whole, or as a rule, the research shows that, like, hey, in some cases, it's certainly much better to get divorced for the kids in terms of psychosocial outcomes and their emotional regulation. I mean, a family that's high in a lot of fighting and strife, there's a reason why sometimes families do get divorced, right? And so divorce does not have to mean that the kid is going to have this horrible outcome going forward. It's all about the process, the rationale, how the parents kind of prioritize the kids over their own needs, and that's what's going to make all the difference. So certainly divorce does not have to be challenging. I think with younger kids, you have to be very, very explicit, and it certainly doesn't hurt to be explicit in some ways with older kids to say, like, why they're getting divorced. Kids tend to be more egocentric. We've already talked about the fact that even teens are pretty egocentric. So giving them a sense of why, ensuring them, even though it seems perhaps very obvious that it was not their fault. I think kids like that reassurance. I think communicating to them, being honest, giving them control when they can. So if, maybe parents are getting divorced and they want to have a say-so in maybe if one parent is moving out, where they live, anything that they can have some control over. I have a friend whose family got divorced, and one big thing to the kids that they really didn't anticipate was where the dog was going to be and how important that was to their kids. So giving them control over those types of things was in any way helpful. And divorce is tricky, especially with things like shared custody. So one thing as a teacher that you may know if you didn't have divorced parents or didn't know divorced parents, a lot of the kind of custody where maybe, and it is more traditional that a mother has kind of primary custody, although that's certainly going to, I think, be changing. It has been changing over time, but it's still much higher with females or with moms having the kids more of a full-time. But the kind of common visitation is kind of strange. And again, if you think about it in terms of, like, is this a good match for kids or not a good match for kids? So typically it's every other weekend and then every Wednesday. It's weird. So you would go so say you live with your mom and your parents are divorced and maybe you have a brother or sister. Every Wednesday you tend to go to your dad's house, if that's the case of this kind of family. So that's kind of disruptive, right? Like in the middle of the week, you go and stay at another house and, another situation. And who knows if there's like a stepmother, a girlfriend, a boy, whatever at that house. Who knows if there's stepchildren there. So it's kind of disruptive. So sometimes just being aware as like a future teacher or a counselor, like that some of those days might be harder. And how can we make that Wednesday, if that's in fact their way of having shared custody, that's an issue. Sometimes what ends up happening, I've seen a lot of kids from families of divorce, and part of it is it's a little bit of a bumpy transition, but most times with some help, they can get through it. But there's also this phenomenon, so imagine yourself as maybe not the primary custodian of your kid. You have that visitation Wednesday every other weekend. When you get the kid, if you're not with them most of the time for 2 weeks and then you have them for the weekend, a lot of families, and again, it's more commonly dads, will have these kids and then they have the most amazing weekend ever because, you want to be, like, if you don't get time with them, you want to have it be really great. And so sometimes it's harder to discipline them, have regulations. It can be hard for the other parent who's maybe not always Mr. or Mrs. Fun all the time. And so, again, you have a little bit of that natural, like, competition between the other parent, or sometimes the kids, they can pull that card of like, I'm going to go live with dad or I'm going to go live with mom. And, you hear a lot of that. And I think part of what I help educate parents is not to give that a lot of emotional credit, although they know exactly what buttons to push, and so something like that, is likely to push, trigger all the right things, and the kid gets a reaction and so forth. So it's a negotiation, and it's a learning process, and it's hard because the kids are at a little bit of vulnerability or at a lot of vulnerability. Parents are at a lot of vulnerability. Divorce is a hard process. So, this is a time when they're going to make a lot of mistakes. It's a challenge, but I think getting some good support in place, again, I don't think it's ever a bad idea to have. I've worked with a lot of parents. It's not a marital therapy. It's kind of like a family therapy, working on how do they negotiate and prioritize their kids and what is the best practice. And again, people get divorced for a reason. They're not communicating super great. They may have different parenting styles and so forth. So I found that the families actually tend to do really, really well. And I think therapy is a huge benefit if you are going through something like that, and to be kind of a place for the kids to talk to. So I think it's a lot about that. So thinking about how that divorce, how communication can be done through, between mom and dad or whoever, guardians, with respect to children, not using kids as pawns in the middle, not talking about the other parent behind the other kid's back, all those kinds of things. Prioritizing your kids above yourself is probably the biggest take-home message, if possible. It's also really hard. So sometimes, obviously, as things evolve, there can be step relationships coming into play. And I've always actually, I've worked with a lot of step parents too, and I found that to be a bit of a tricky line to walk for step parents and for kids, because as a kid, you're a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you like them, you might make your other parent feel bad. They might feel bad or guilty about liking this person. If you don't like them and you fight with them, then you're not liking them and you're fighting with them. And so I also think how step parents negotiate is another tricky piece of things. So how they parent, or how they feel comfortable, because I think it sends a kind of a negative message or a lack of caring or concern message if the step parent has no role in parenting, or any disciplinary issue, they completely wash their hands of that. I think that can send a wrong message to the kids. But it's also, you don't want to step on any toes, and you don't want to take the place of that biological parent. And so I think that's a challenging line to walk, and I think step parents have it pretty hard. But I would say to err on the side of being involved. Just they're probably going to reject you or struggle with you. I think you need to kind of be the adult and kind of keep being there, not pushing yourself, but kind of being there steadily and showing them. These are kids who have been through a divorce. Their trust has been a little bit shattered. They're a little bit more vulnerable, and you as the adult need to show them that you're there for them. And even if they roll their eyes at you and call you a name or don't listen to you or disrespect you, that you're going to say, hey, I don't condone that behavior, but I'm here for you. I'm there for you. And so I think, making sure that sometimes some parents are too hands-off. Sometimes some parents are a little too involved too. And obviously this makes a big difference on what age the kid is, or when the step-parent gets involved. So it's much easier in a lot of ways if a kid has a step-parent come into the picture when they're little, right? 2 years old, it's not a big deal. But when, they're 10 years old, it's going to be a lot different than a 13-year-old, than is a 18, 19-year-old. And, that kind of stuff happens. So it's all a negotiation. It's all dependent on kind of the players involved. And then you may have step siblings, and so they may or may not be entering this adolescent's home. So that's a whole nother issue to kind of keep into play. And again, then now you're involving potentially a couple other parents. So maybe the step kids that are in your house, or your stepbrother or sister, have, very different parenting styles from their parents versus your parents, and now they're split up, and there's two other parents trying to negotiate how to get together. It can be kind of a mess. But again, it's not always bad. So one of the main things I also wanted to tell you is that both children and males tend to be more externalizing and more present in terms of how they react to a divorce. So kids are going to be more likely to tantrum, act out, yell, scream, cry, those kinds of things. Even males are a little bit more likely to get frustrated, aggressive, and kind of deal with it and then move on. Females have a tendency, particularly adolescent females, when parents get divorced, they tend to internalize it more. And they end up having and they tend to look as if they're coping really well. They're not having outbursts. They're not, typically doing as poorly in school as perhaps the boys may be doing. But what ends up happening over time, you see my little hand, like, over time, is that there's a phenomenon called the sleeper effect. So females are vulnerable, not necessarily like 100% likelihood, but are more vulnerable to having the kind of sequelae of a divorce affect them in later relationships. And part of that's because they internalize it, but also part of it is because, like, you don't typically get into very serious relationships until later. And so that's where the divorce affects them most significantly, is their sense of trust, their views on marriage, how they interact with others, sense of, again, trust in a variety of ways. So being aware of some of those issues, again, it's not meant to be a secret. It's meant to say, look, the research is pretty clear on this, that girls tend to have like kind of longer term issues with relationships. So maybe it's worth exploring those issues, or if you're noticing some patterns in yourself or in a kid you're working with in terms of how they're interacting with their romantic relationships and their families have been divorced, maybe having a sense of an understanding of normalizing, hey, this tends to happen. How can we kind of talk about ways to circumvent these things? How can we address some of the issues and concerns that you have, perhaps linked to your parents' divorce or whatnot? So that's certainly something to think about. I also hope that you enjoyed the video on the In Our Shoes. So again, I really do want you guys to appreciate that there are really cool and different and types of families out there, and how that might affect children. And the research really shows that in terms of the effectiveness of gay and lesbian and transgendered parents, they're as effective. They do a great job. It's sometimes, though, the challenges or bullying from external sources that are the cause of the problems, rather than them setting some kind of a bad example or whatever type of bias someone who's critiquing that lifestyle might discuss. So the data really supports the fact that, as like any other group of people, there are good parents and bad parents, and it's certainly not related to your sexual orientation. And it's about, but again, sometimes these types of external activities or there's so many books that just talk about a mom and a dad, and you really have to look for, and I do, and my husband kind of is, he's like, what's this book? Jimmy has two daddies or whatever. And I really try hard to hammer that home for my own children, because I want them to not make assumptions about what a family should be or is. Every family is special and unique in their own way. And I know I'm forgetting something, but my computer died, so I can't see my computer of what else is left in here. But those are some of the highlights from the family chapter, and sorry that it's two lovely videos for you. Take care. Bye.